Week 5 of the NFL season is officially here, so in today's video, I want to give my reaction to every single game of week number 5. So as I mentioned, we are going to be talking about every single game of week number 5. We are going to start off by talking about the Thursday night football games, and we will be going all the way up to the Sunday night football game between the Dallas Cowboys and the Pittsburgh Steelers. So with that all being said, these are my picks that I made for my predictions video a couple days ago. As you can see, the picks aren't that good, but if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button, and let's get into the video. So as I mentioned, we are going to begin by talking about the Thursday night matchup between the Buccaneers and the Atlanta Falcons. This was a very high scoring game that went to overtime. The final score was 36-30, in which Baker Mayfield had himself a pretty solid day, but the biggest story of the day was of course Kirk Cousins going for over 500 yards with 4 touchdowns. This, in a lot of ways, was a bit of a breakout game for this Falcons offense. Drake London really got going with over 100 receiving yards in the day with 12 catches. They also got other guys like Kyle Pitts going, who had 88 yards, and then of course Darnell Mooney with over 100 with himself. Then of course the big play to Kadero Hodge that ultimately would go on to win the game for them kind of was the big highlight of this game. For both these teams, I do think that these are top 10 level teams. I still think Tampa Bay is a great team that probably could have won this game if a couple of things went their way. But for the Atlanta Falcons, you put together a really solid game that still feels like you could still improve upon. Obviously, you had the 2 botched field goals, and I think Kirk Cousins made a couple plays that he would like to have back. So ultimately speaking, you had a great day where Kirk Cousins had over 500 yards, but I still think this team has another level to get to. Then we fast forward to our Sunday games. We're going to begin with the game that was actually in London between the Minnesota Vikings, who are now 5-0, going up against the New York Jets, who are now 2-3. For starters, with the Minnesota Vikings, this year has been such an incredible start to the season. I think everyone, including myself, thought that this team was going to struggle through the first 5 weeks of the season because of the JJ McCarthy injury and because of what their schedule was looking like. But thus far through the first 5 weeks, they have handled business and are currently 5-0 and have beaten some very good teams like the Niners, like the Texans, and now a team like the New York Jets. In this matchup, it definitely wasn't a very pretty game from this Minnesota Vikings offense. Sam Darnold didn't have his greatest day. He was very inefficient, threw for less than 200 yards and had an interception. But this team was able to get the job done primarily through their defense. This is a New York Jets team that has a fantastic defense in their own right, so it does make sense this was a bit more of a defensive battle. And because it was a defensive battle, you would think that that would lead towards a team like the New York Jets, who, in my opinion, have a better defense. But instead, it went the way of the Minnesota Vikings with their defense that is very tenacious and is able to create a lot of turnovers. In the first half, this Jets offense really couldn't get going. They only had 7 points, and Aaron Rodgers was not looking like the Aaron Rodgers that we typically know and love. So I think you have to give a lot of credit to this Vikings team for finding ways to win a game in which their offense wasn't playing that well. At the end of the day, the offense only scored a handful of points, and you got to give a ton of credit to that defense for helping this team get their way to get a victory. Then we begin our 12 o'clock games between the Chicago Bears and the Carolina Panthers. For my prediction, I did think the Panthers were going to find a way to win this one with their veteran quarterback in Andy Dalton going up against Caleb Williams, who hasn't been playing that well. And what I said the past couple weeks about Caleb Williams is that I thought that he was playing better every single week. It just felt like he wasn't quite yet there where he wants to be. And ultimately, this felt like a bit of a culmination of everything that this season has been leading towards for Caleb Williams. Obviously, the first couple weeks really weren't that great for him, but I felt like last week there was a lot of things to take away from. And then this week, he had himself probably his best game of the season. On the day, he was 20 for 29 for over 300 yards and 2 touchdowns. And he definitively basically carried this team on his back. The run game was there. It was definitely better than what we've seen, but it still wasn't that great. In fact, I feel like Caleb Williams could have scored even more touchdowns if it wasn't for those 1-yard handoffs that he kept giving to guys like Roschon and DeAndre Swift. So I think you have to give a ton of credit to Caleb Williams, DJ Moore, this entire offense for finally figuring things out and kind of getting this offense to look somewhat capable. Now, granted, this is a Panthers defense that is outright horrendous, so we do have to take that into account, but we do have to give them the credit that they do deserve. And then for the Carolina Panthers, listen, you're not a very good team, so this was kind of to be expected. I guess I gave a little bit too much credit to Andy Dalton for that win they had a couple weeks ago, but for the sake of the Carolina Panthers, the run game still looks pretty good, and Andy Dalton still looks, in my opinion, better than Bryce Young. With that said, though, Bryce Young did come in late in the game and did look competent, so we'll see if potentially there is a quarterback change in the next couple weeks, but I kind of doubt that they will be. Then we had a game between the Cleveland Browns and the Washington Commanders, another game with a young quarterback going up against a veteran quarterback, and yet again, the younger quarterback, this time Jaden Daniels, completely outplayed the veteran quarterback, this time Deshaun Watson. In a lot of ways, the two games were actually kind of similar. Both quarterbacks had really good games. Obviously, Jaden didn't have his greatest game. He's had plenty of better games, but Jaden still played a very well game. Whereas for the veteran team like Cleveland that is just really struggling right now, basically everything that could have went wrong has gone wrong and has continued to go wrong in this game. We'll start off with the Browns side of things because this is probably the more interesting part about this game. I personally do believe that at this point, the Deshaun Watson trade might go down as the worst trade of all time. So if that's the case, and because of what I've seen from Deshaun, I kind of feel like this team would be better off going in a different direction with Jameis Winston as the starter moving forward. Now, yes, Jameis is a very problematic quarterback in his own right, more on the field than off the field. Off the field, he seems like a great guy, but on the field, he does a lot of chaotic things. But the one thing that I will say that he does do better than Deshaun Watson is give this team a chance with the deep ball. Deshaun Watson is just unbelievably conservative and almost afraid to take any sort of shots down the field. And it's not just one-on-one deep shots that are just kind of Hail Mary type of plays. It's just anything that is going downfield. Deshaun almost feels like he completely avoids it and doesn't even look at it. Whereas with Jameis Winston, he's at least going to try to give those guys opportunities, which is the exact same thing that Joe Flacco did for this team last year. So in my opinion, if there's any way that this Browns team can sort of fix this season and kind of get their way back into the mix of things for the wild card spot, I think a quarterback change has to happen because Deshaun Watson just isn't going to improve. And then for Washington side of things, this is again a continuation of what we've seen the past couple weeks. Jaden Daniels has looked ridiculously good. He's great in both the passing game and in the rushing game. I would say passing the ball wise, this wasn't one of his better games. He did have an interception in the red zone, which was a really weird interception that you don't see from Jaden Daniels typically. And it wasn't a very efficient game. He didn't have a bad day by any means. Hell, he beat the team by over 20 points. So credit to the young kid. Moving on, we had an AFC East matchup between the Miami Dolphins and the New England Patriots. Both these teams came into this game basically with the season on the line in a lot of ways. And in this game, with a lot of ugly football, the Miami Dolphins found a way to win this game. Obviously, we all knew this was not going to be an offensive shootout or anything resembling that. We all knew that this was going to be a defensive slugfest in which the defenses were going to have to force turnovers and going to have to make plays in order to keep their teams in it. And that's exactly what played out. The defenses were able to make enough plays to keep their respective teams in the game. It just ultimately came down to which team has the more talented offense. And in this situation, it was the Miami Dolphins. Say what you want about this Dolphins team, they actually do have some really good playmakers. Guys like Jalen Wright, Raheem Mostert, Devon Achane, who hopefully comes back healthy, Tyreek Hill, Waddle, Jonnu Smith, all those guys. Whereas for New England, they just don't simply have those options. And because this Miami team has so many different options to guys they can get the ball to, it just felt like inevitably they were going to be able to get some points on the board. Whereas for this New England team, it's like every single inch they really have to fight for. Both these teams have horrendous offensive lines. Both these teams have a lot of question marks on both these teams. But for the Miami Dolphins, you at least put yourself in a position to ultimately win this game. This does not change my perspective on either of these teams. I still feel like both these teams are really bad. And in the case of Miami, this team is going to continue to be one of the worst teams in the NFL for as long as Tua isn't actually out there on that team. Moving on, we had an absolutely awesome game here between the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Indianapolis Colts. The Jaguars season was essentially on the line. It kind of was last week where they had a really big nail biter to the Texans, but in this one, it really would have been over with if they did not find a way to beat a pretty good Colts team. But gotta give credit to the Jacksonville Jaguars. They were able to keep the lead throughout the day, and even when this Colts offense finally got going in that fourth quarter, this Jaguars offense was able to do enough to ultimately keep the lead and ultimately win the game. This was a very high-scoring game, a game that I didn't really think was going to be all that high of scoring because of how bad both these teams have looked in certain spots, and with the Colts not having a starting quarterback, I felt like this was going to be a really big kind of defensive slugfest with some offensive spurts here and there. But that really wasn't the case. Yes, the defenses played well throughout the first three quarters, but then in that fourth quarter, basically all hell broke loose and both these teams put up like 24 and 17 points respectively. I do want to give a bit of credit here to the Jaguars offense. Tank Bigsby actually looks really good running the football, very aggressive style, and whenever Travis Etienne is a bit more of that elusive back, your change of back option, somebody like Tank Bigsby can come in there and be a bit more of your bruiser option, and that's what he did in today's game. I also do want to give credit to Trevor Lawrence, who's been receiving a ton of hate for how he's been playing this season. I thought he had himself a very good game outside of that one terrible interception. And whenever you're going up against a team that is able to find a second win late in that fourth quarter and catch a big shift of momentum, it's really hard for a team like Jacksonville that is 0-4 on the day and just hasn't had anything going to still find a way to continue to fight and still find a way to continue to battle even when you're leading for most of the day. So I do want to give credit to Jacksonville for being able to hold on to a lead and continue to throw back punches against a team that was finding their second wind late into that fourth quarter. Moving on though, we had a very fun matchup between the Houston Texans and the Buffalo Bills. Both of these teams, in my opinion, are two playoff contenders and easily probably two Super Bowl contenders in their own rights. We all knew that this was going to be a bit of a weird game here between Josh Allen and of course Stefon Diggs of the Houston Texans. We all knew that both these players had revenge on their minds, and even though revenge was on both their minds, neither player particularly played great. I would say Stefon Diggs played better than Josh Allen, given Stefon Diggs had 6 catches for 82 yards and Josh Allen was 9 for 30, which is just crazy. But this was a game where it really did feel like this Bills offense could have really used a number one option like a Stefon Diggs. Again, Josh Allen was 9 for 30, and his number one receiver had 1 catch for 49 yards in Keon Coleman. A lot of the reason why I've been optimistic about this Bills offense was because I felt like each receiver played a specific role. For example, Keon Coleman is a bit more of your big playmaker type of guy. Dalton Kincaid can do a bit of everything at the tight end position. Khalil Shakir, who didn't play in this game, bit more of your underneath slot receiver type of guy, and then Matt Collins is your do-it-all type of guy. But this was a game where you really needed one guy who could continue to But this was a game where this Bills team needed a guy who can consistently get open, which they just didn't have. Whereas a guy like Stefon Diggs can still do that at a very high level, so it did feel like there was a bit of a void for this Bills offense with not having a guy who could consistently get open. Now again, in defense of Buffalo, they did not have their number one receiver, so I do want to give them a bit of some slack here, but ultimately speaking, 9 of 30 against a Texans defense that hasn't proven to be great so far this year is kind of crazy. And for the Texans side of things, listen, there's still a lot of things that hasn't quite fully clicked yet for this Texans offense. This offense was playing super well in the first quarter, and then second, third, and fourth quarter, they just couldn't find ways to finish drives. So while the Texans were able to find a way to get a victory here, especially late in the game, where we'll talk about the fourth quarter here in a second, I think you still want to give credit to the CJ Stroud-led Texans, who found a way to get a win against a very good Bills defense. But again, I just do want to point out this offense feels like it's missing something. Maybe that is just Joe Mixon coming back healthy and playing like he did in week 1. And then addressing the elephant in the room, I thought both these teams were trying to lose this game late into the fourth quarter, where DeMeco Ryans has a very questionable play call where they decided to pass the football even though they're in field goal range, and ultimately it would have been a lot easier to just kick the field goal and take the lead, whereas they took the hard route and ultimately threw a pass that led to a 15-yard penalty. They have to punt the ball to Buffalo. And then for Buffalo's side of things, I don't know what the heck they were thinking, throwing 3 bombs down the field when you're in your own end zone. And then ultimately, Houston would find a way to win this game. It was just so bizarre and just some terrible coaching in its own right. Then we had another really good matchup here, this one in the AFC North between the Baltimore Ravens and the Cincinnati Bengals. A bit of a theme here for a couple of these teams. This was a game for the Bengals that kind of felt like a make or break for their season. Now, I will say, I still do think this Bengals team can find a way to put together some wins to kind of get back into that wild card conversation, but it's going to be very difficult now that they're 1-4 to actually do it. They're going to have to string at least like 7 wins out of the next 9 or so. And then for the side of the Ravens here, listen, this was a very impressive victory. You ultimately came from behind against this Bengals team that was really going offensively and found a way to win in overtime. A lot of conversation this season has been about how quarterbacks are really struggling to move the ball down the field with all this too high safety garbage that people keep talking about. But in this game, both these quarterbacks threw for easily over 300 yards. We saw some big games out of guys like Zay Flowers, Derrick Henry, Jamar Chase, and T. Higgins. So to anybody out there who has been complaining about, oh, all this too high safety stuff, offenses aren't moving the ball like they used to, just watch this game. It was really good offensive battles where the defenses were god-awful. And for this Ravens team, listen, if you're 3-2, but you easily could be 5-0 if you don't have a toenail out of bounds against the Chiefs and if you don't just have a blunder late in the game against the Raiders. Whereas for Cincinnati, you're probably telling yourself, how the hell are we 1-4 when we are going to overtime with a Ravens team that is, in my opinion, one of the Super Bowl favorites? So for both these teams, it was a very good game where both these offenses were absolutely electric, and both these teams should be good teams moving forward, even if their records don't look that incredible right now. Then we move on to our 3 o'clock games. We're going to begin with the Denver Broncos versus the Las Vegas Raiders. This was yet again another game here where Bo Nix put together a really good second half and a really good second quarter to find a way to beat a Raiders team that is really freaking bad. It didn't look good early on. The Raiders had a 10-0 lead at one point versus the Broncos, and as a Raiders fan, I was feeling really optimistic about what this team could do. And then, of course, the Raiders do what the Raiders do. Gardner Minshew throws 2 interceptions, and then everything collapses from there. Listen, for this Raiders team, we all knew that this team wasn't going to be very good offensively. It was really going to come down to how good this defense can be. And so far this season, this defense has simply just not been good enough to uphold this offense to keep them at a relatively high level of play. And when it comes down to the quarterback situation, both Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell just simply are not good options at the quarterback position. For me, I would personally just say to start Aiden O'Connell moving forward because it at least gives you a new option to go forward to and a new leader of this team. I just don't think that Gardner Minshew is that guy for this team. And then for Denver's side of thing, again, this was another game here where Bo Nix continues to improve and look good. It wasn't pretty from the get-go, but once things get rolling for Bo Nix, he can really sling the ball and play a really high effective game for this team. He also had a crazy drop touchdown from, I want to say, Troy Franklin, which would have been another like 60 yards and a touchdown. So this stat line that Bo Nix had could have looked a lot better had that been caught. Also, there was a bit of an altercation between Bo Nix and Sean Payton. From what I've been told, it just felt like a little bit of bickering about a disagreement. So don't look too far into it. I know some people have been speculating. Don't look too far into it. Then we had one of the biggest upsets of the week between the Arizona Cardinals and the San Francisco 49ers. The Cardinals found a way late in the game here to beat a San Francisco team that has not looked as good as we thought they would be. We'll start off with Arizona's side of things here. Listen, the first half was extremely ugly. The final score in the first half was 23-10. So you go into that second quarter and you're you go into that second half and you're feeling really distraught because you're down double digits and it's not looking good. Your offense hasn't been able to put any drives together, but you just kind of stayed the course, and eventually this offense got going while the defense was able to make some plays, force some turnovers, and slow down this run game enough to give your offenses some chances to go out there and make plays. So I do want to give credit to the Arizona Cardinals. I still feel like this Cardinals team isn't where we would want them to be, but they're still clearly not as talented as the opponent. So for them to beat a team like San Francisco is definitely a good sign of what they potentially could be. And then for San Francisco's side of things, this is just a really bad loss. And again, this is another loss where you had a big lead and blew it late in the second half. In a lot of ways, this game felt kind of similar to that LA Rams game where you led for the entirety of the game and then you make a couple mistakes late in the game, whether it's turnovers or just poor red zone execution, and then eventually the opposing team gets their offense going and ultimately wins the game. And that's exactly what happened in this one against an inferior team in the Arizona Cardinals. If you look at the 3 losses that San Francisco has, it's to the Rams, the Vikings, and the Cardinals. 2 of those teams are really bad football teams right now, and this Niners team, which we all think can be Super Bowl champions, just does not look the part both offensively nor defensively. But I did just lie about the biggest upset, because the biggest upset of the week, in my personal opinion, might have been the Giants versus the Seahawks. The Giants won this game 29-20, and this is just an extremely disappointing way for the Seahawks to come back from a game against the Detroit Lions. Listen, last week you go to Detroit and you have a really competitive game against a very good team, and then you have, in my opinion, a really kind of inexcusable loss here to a bad New York Giants team. This was also a Giants team that didn't have their main offensive catalyst in Malik Neighbors, so they're stuck with guys like Daniel Jones, Tyrone Tracy, and Darius Slayton. But in this game, Tyrone Tracy had over 120 rushing yards, Darius Slayton had over 120 receiving yards, and Daniel Jones might have just had arguably his best game the past like 3 seasons for this Giants team. And this is a Seahawks team that we all kind of was thinking that with the addition of their new head coach, that this was going to be a new and improved defense that would support an offense that should already be very good. But that didn't happen in this game. The offense was fine. It definitely wasn't good, but they were able to have some sustained drives, put up points, and look competent throughout most of the game. But when the defense is making Daniel Jones look like prime Aaron Rodgers and prime Drew Brees and all those great quarterbacks, that's never going to bode well for your team. The Giants dominated time of possession. They only had 2 penalties on the day. They were 7 for 16 on 3rd down, and they didn't bite themselves in the butt like the Seahawks team did. The Seahawks team had a fumble loss. They had 6 penalties for 30 yards. They only had 22 minutes of time of possession, and they were 3 for 11 on 3rd down, which all gave the advantage to a team led by Daniel Jones, which is really inexcusable for a Seahawks team that we all thought was improved enough to potentially be a team that makes a deep playoff run. Ultimately, for the Giants, this is a great win. You're still a bad team, but hey, you're a lot better than maybe I would have expected you to be because you just beat a Seahawks team that I think is pretty good. Moving on, we have the Green Bay Packers versus the LA Rams. This is actually our final 3 o'clock game. There's a lot of things that could be said about this one. The Rams have looked really bad to start the season. They don't have Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua. There's some offensive line issues. This defense is very young and youthful and doesn't have a very good secondary, so there's a lot of issues defensively. And I would say that all of their losses have been primarily because of those reasons. They're very inexperienced on defense, and they just don't have the weaponry offensively to continue to sustain long drives throughout the game. It also doesn't help when Matthew Stafford is a very old quarterback who can't move around in the pocket that well, and he's also been throwing a bunch of interceptions. Even though Kyren Williams had himself a very good game and Jordan Whittington played very well in the absence of those receivers, this LA Rams offense just simply cannot continue to sustain drives with all of the injuries and with the poor play coming from the quarterback position. Whereas for Jordan Love and this Packers team, listen, that interception was really terrible from Jordan Love, but he was able to come back, bounce back from it, and played really good from the 3rd quarter and 2nd quarter and 4th quarter beyond. Even though guys like Jaden Reed really didn't get going like they've been going throughout the season, Tucker Kraft was able to make up for it. They also finally got Josh Jacobs going, so that does bode well for this Packers team. This isn't a great win for the Packers because this Rams team is just really bad and you only beat them by 5, but I will say I still think this Packers team is very good. And then lastly, we had the Dallas Cowboys and the Pittsburgh Steelers on Sunday Night Football. Final score is 20-17, but in my opinion, I don't think that final score is really indicative of how badly this Cowboys team dominated the Steelers team. The Cowboys almost doubled the total yardage from the Pittsburgh Steelers. The only thing holding back this Cowboys team was they had 11 penalties for 87 yards and 3 turnovers. By the way, those 3 turnovers from the Cowboys, all 3 of those were on Dak. 2 of those were really bad interceptions, and then 1 of them was just TJ Watt. So I'm not worried about those interceptions from Dak. If Dak doesn't throw those weird interceptions, and let's say they get some points off of that, this easily could have been a double-digit victory for the Cowboys. And by the way, this Cowboys team that has been consistently struggling with penalties just has to clean that up, because if they clean that side of things up, then this team is looking a little bit better. For Dallas, the run game was actually kind of competent today, and the offensive line looked fairly well against a good and stout defensive line from Pittsburgh. And defensively for the Cowboys, despite the fact that they're missing like 4 starters on the defensive line and a couple secondary members, they were still able to find a way to play some really good ball against a Steelers team that wants to run the football, which was the kryptonite for the Dallas Cowboys in weeks 2 and 3. So I do want to give credit to that defense and that defensive line for standing up against a Steelers team that wants to run the football. And then there's the Steelers side of things. I know Justin Fields had 2 touchdown passes, but he really did not play that good throughout the day. I didn't think he played particularly bad, but I thought, when it comes down to making those game-changing plays, he wasn't really able to do a whole lot of it. This team also could not run the ball against a Dallas Cowboys team that has 2 edge rushers who are on their 3rd string depth chart. Not to mention they have arguably the worst defensive tackle in Mozzie Smith, and they're missing Deron Bland, Kalen Carson. So for this offense to only have a little over 200 total yards and only 17 points, in my opinion, is a tad bit inexcusable. If you want to be a respectable playoff contender and potential Super Bowl contender, you got to score more than 17 points against a wounded and, quite frankly, bad Dallas Cowboys defense. Again, this Cowboys defense is on their 4th string practice squad cornerback, as well as having 3rd string and newly acquired Carl Lawson on the defensive line, yet you weren't able to take advantage of that. So for Pittsburgh, if you want to be respected as a top 10 team, you have to find a way to beat this Cowboys team that frankly was trying to hand gift and give you this game. The Cowboys had 3 turnovers, multiple backups, and 11 penalties, yet despite that, they still won the game. So for Pittsburgh, this is a horrendous loss, and for Dallas, this is a really impressive victory. But again, I do want to remind you guys, these were all my picks. Again, not a great week prediction-wise, but hopefully we'll bounce back next week. And if you guys enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.